Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. We are currently exploring Eudora Welty's 1941 short story collection titled A Curtain of Green and Other Stories. During this series, we are going to read and discuss 3 stories each week between now and February 12th with a 4-week winter break from December 25th to January 15th. Today, we're going to be discussing Petrified Man, The Key, and Keela the Outcast Indian Maiden. I'm Jessica Russell, director of the Eudora Welty House and Garden. We are grateful to Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend, and our friend, Eudora Welty's biographer and professor emerita of Millsaps College, for guiding these discussions. Just some housekeeping. Once again, if you're new, to comment or ask a question, click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and select the raise hand function. If you're on a tablet or phone, you might have to tap the screen for that option to appear, but that's how you get our attention. I'll be watching for you along with Suzanne, and a lively discussion often takes place in the chat, so be sure to glance over at the chat box every now and then. And with all that said, I'll let in some last few people. With all that said, Suzanne, are we ready to begin?
We're ready. I have to say, alas, I don't follow the chat because I simply can't manage to do that and follow the conversation, but I'll try to read the chat afterwards. Let me begin with some few background comments, and then we'll move to talking about the stories in the order in which they appear in the volume. Petrified Man was a story that Eudora sent to the Southern Review in January of 1937, and Robert Penn Warren rejected it. And when she got it back, she put it in the kitchen wood stove and burned it, and there it went, right up the flue. At the Welty house, you can see the flue. In March of 1938, a year later, Warren wrote to ask Eudora if he could see Petrified Man again. He'd been thinking about it. And because she had burned it, she just ignored the request. And then 6 months after that, in September of 1938, he wrote again to ask if he could see it. And she retyped it from memory and submitted it. And it was taken and published in the spring of 1939. When Eudora met Robert Penn Warren, she told him that she had a confession to make. She thought maybe she'd been a little bit dishonest because she had rewritten that story and not submitted the same one she had sent him the first time. And his response was, "There was nothing dishonest about that. You wrote it, didn't you?" So that was Petrified Man. The Key, we're not quite sure when The Key was first written. We do know that in 1938, Eudora tried to put together a novel for a competition at Houghton Mifflin. And that novel was called The Night of the Little House, and part of it had a version of The Key in it. And that The Key was then not published until 1941, when Harper's Bazaar took it. Mary Lou Aswell had taken Clytie, but then she saw The Key and she asked if they could swap Clytie for The Key, and she published The Key in Harper's Bazaar. Keela, the Outcast Indian Maiden, was sparked by something Eudora heard while she was working for the WPA in 1936, and that is a story of a carnival geek who would eat live chickens. And so the horror of that and her experience with that came about in the story that was published in 1940, Keela the Outcast Indian Maiden. Keela the Outcast Indian Maiden, as you are, I'm sure, well aware by now, uses a lot of dehumanizing language. It comes from the mouth of characters. It helps to define those characters, but we will be careful not to use that language ourselves as we talk about the story, and we can refer to it, we can discuss it, but not repeat it. All right. I think we should talk about what recurring themes we find in the stories, particularly the portrait of women as marginalized and as in search of power over their own lives, the linking of women to other marginalized groups. The theme that Robert Penn Warren identified in the first really good essay published about Eudora Welty's fiction, it was called The Love and the Separateness in Miss Welty. And we can talk about those issues of love and separateness. And we might also want to talk about freak shows and sideshows and why Eudora is using these in her fiction. And I'd like us to think also about narrative strategies in the stories, about the ways in which Petrified Man and Keela, the outcast Indian maiden, maybe seem allied in the telling, the ways in which the key departs from that, the ways in which Welty calls attention to herself as a narrator in the key. So if we can think about those things as well and the reasons for them. So having said all of that, shall we start by talking about Petrified Man? Would somebody like to start us off? Petrified Man, one of Welty's earliest stories. Comments about Petrified Man? Yeah, Joubert.
Well, I would just start out by saying that her observational skills are just amazing. Actually, I had to have some pedicure work done as a result of an unfortunate accident wearing sandals. And there was a little boy that was running around the floor of the nail shop as I was getting myself treated. So, I mean, it's her observational skills and the dialogue and the detail of reality was just absolutely amazing.
I think so too. I love it when she talks about the Leota and Mrs. Fletcher talking to each other in the mirror. That's exactly anybody who's been having their hair cut knows that's exactly what you do, and that your person who's cutting your hair probably very rarely stops talking. So we have that detail as well. Beverly.
I think this is a really good example of what she says in the video that we show at the house, that she would sit down next to her mother and her mother's friends and say, now start talking. Mm-hmm. And that's mostly what this story is. It's people talking. And it's brilliant.
It could be dramatized easily, couldn't it? It's primarily dialogue. Now, there is some narration, and the narration shapes what we think about these characters and what they're saying, but it doesn't comment directly, but it shapes through, as we've been talking about, through the observation, through calling this a den, for instance, of Henna, forget how, let me just find it. Hidden in this den of curling fluid and henna packs, separated by a lavender swing door from the other customers who were being gratified in other booths, she could give her curiosity its freedom. She looked expectantly at the black part in Leota's yellow curls as she bent to light the cigarette. So that, I mean, the people being gratified in booths, calling it a den, and then that black part in yellow, and the hairdresser's yellow curls. Yeah, Alec.
I guess I should throw in, I had a friend, relative, long time ago, who shall remain unidentified, and who had an appointment at the same time Miss Welty did. Was it Fannie Mae's where she got her hair done? And so this came to the attention of my wife and me, and we said, well, really? Well, what did she say? Because this lady said she could hear her every day talking every time she went there. And she said, well, she was just bitter. And we said, well, wait a minute. What do you mean? What did she say? She said, well, she was just bitter all the time. And so what I think is that Miss Welty would say things to provoke other people to say things. So she would hear this, this gossip and stuff that women do. I think she said things to provoke them. And as we know, as Beverly said, she loved listening to people. So there you go.
Well, I have to say that I've talked to Eudora Welty many, many times in many different situations. I've traveled with her. I never heard a bitter word from her. I did hear, some sharp words. I wouldn't have ever called them bitter. So I don't know. I don't think she was prone to try to provoke people either, Alec. But I think what she probably didn't do was participate in the world of the beauty parlor too much, and that might have been taken as bitter, because she wouldn't have been inclined to gossip. And there's a lot of gossip that goes on in the beauty parlor. Yeah.
I agree with you, what you said.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else about Petrified Man? Let's talk about these women and their attitudes toward their husbands, for instance. Yeah, Harriet. Whoops, we can't hear you, Harriet.
Am I doing okay now?
Mhm.
So I would add to the list of the things that we're drawing from story to story,
Yeah.
the forms of the stories. And I've called these stories puzzle texts. And I think they are little whittled puzzles that surprise us, that are that create, puzzles that we have to solve as we read them, and that the delight is what Eudora talks about. Surprised expectation being she calls it the quantum obstruction, I think, which is maybe a satire of academic language, but surprised expectation, that is the pleasure of reading the stories. And in this case, we've got two idle conversations that are a week apart. And we sense that idle conversations can reveal the deepest concerns. And so we're looking for the underlying pattern in their chatter. And these women are talking about beauty treatments and marriages and pregnancy and abortion. And then a week later, the freak show and rape. And so I'd argue that the topic is sexuality as defined as power over the other sex, and that the women come to the Otis Salon because beauty is the primary gender-approved tool in their power arsenal, in a power contest that is in which a woman plays beauty against money and power and violence, and in the context of the comedy of the story, there is emphasis on the disciplining of the body. In this, we've got all of this detail of crass and slightly grotesque efforts to create beauty. But there is this kind of comedy of the discipline of the body, where there is a problem in that the women want to give their hair a new body with a permanent, but the parlor's creations are not permanent, and the women have real bodies that change in shape, and so the discussion of pregnancy is framed in a way that we have pregnancy as deforming, as damaging to that power base, and it is and it's a discussion of abortion, which is rather amazing, I think, in terms of the time period and what all is going on. But what we think of issues of pregnancy in the 1930s. But there's but then a week later we have the freak show and discussions of the husbands that are that are, how would you like to have a husband like that, a pygmy or petrified man? And in a sense, all of their conversations about their husbands have been about that, have been about the ways in which their husbands are pygmies or petrified men, the ways in which their husbands are under their control, or at least the women delude themselves to that in that way. And the comeuppance is Mr. Petrie, who turns out to be not petrified at all, but a rapist, and rape as the sense of power over the other sex being defined as sexuality. Sexuality in this taking the general cultural definition of sexuality as power over the other sex and turning it into violence and the logical extension of this cultural definition.
All right. So yeah. So here we have these women in the beauty parlor, which really is kind of like the locker room for men. So men go to the locker room and they brag about their sexual exploits, and the ladies go to the beauty parlor and they do their bragging, and they're focused on beauty. And Jessica may say something about this too, but Eudora had a series of pictures that were sort of fake beauty parlor pictures where she's putting on
Right.
Household cleansers and bug killer and everything else on the face. And so there's that satire of this whole question of beauty and the women focusing on beauty, and then on power and trying to take power. Well, Jo Ellen.
Yeah, I would add that the culture of violence that Harriet's been talking about certainly informs the beauty parlor. And we get a lot of the information about that, Suzanne, as you said, in the narrative commentary. Leota combing hastily is sort of hold Mrs. Fletcher down by the hair. And the women are colored and curled and cooked and plucked and
14 minutes.
wound up, yeah, and by other women. And in fact, the women are presented as violent themselves. A pike is a weapon. Fletcher is an arrow maker. They have blood red nails and lips and fingernails, and they're really for battle. This whole thing is about a battle among women, certainly. Leota unhappy with Mrs. Pike because she discovers in the magazine the identity of the petrified man. Mrs. what's her name? Fletcher against Mrs. Pike just generally because of her acute eyes. So anyway, that violence spills over, and wherever it's coming from. Yeah.
The women, who know that they lack power are claiming power here. And they are abusing power in a sense, in the same way that it's been abused in treating them, I think. Yeah, Cheryl.
Okay. So what Jo Ellen just said reminded me of the purple hat lady. But I that's not what I wanted to comment on. I wanted to comment on what everything Harriet said. Put in perspective for me just how shocking that content is.
Okay.
How shocking that content is for that time period. And I don't remember where I read it, but it's something about Eudora being able to write, like, when did she find time to write stories? Because she was, so sociable and loved being with her friends. And I just wonder, not only when did she find time to write them, but why her mind, for her first collection of stories, or how her mind was able to come up with all of these different topics. And then I'll just conclude with, in Harriet's book, Eudora, Welty, and Mystery, there's a really good chapter on the petrified man and old Mr. Marblehall.
Thank you. Thanks for the plug for that book. Everybody go and buy that book. All right, Pearl, how about you?
Just a couple of things. that, first of all, one of this always makes me think about the Medusa figures in Welty throughout because of the way that the ladies look. And secondly, there is one of the photographs from the sideshows shows the poster of the ossified man, which might have given her this sort of idea since she brings in the sideshows.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Pearl. Yeah.
And then also this story, you might have already said this, I was again late coming on, that this story was included in the 1938 O. Henry Memorial Prizes. And Barn Burning by Faulkner won the first prize. And after the first three, then it's just alphabetical. So her story is last. But I thought I would read what is in the introduction about this. It says, Eudora Welty's sharp, incisive dialogue in Petrified Man brought decided opinions from the judges and no doubt will be a controversial subject among readers. Its highest praise came from Mr. Poor, who is, I mean, that's really shocking because earlier Poor at the New York Times Book Review had been quite an enemy, who thought it shrewd and true, with an uncommon swing and bite to the writing and a skill in characterization that lays bare whole lives in a sentence. I thought that was quite good. But then he points out as an example, quote, I met Mr. Fletcher, or rather he met me in a rental library, said Mrs. Fletcher with dignity. And then Mr. Poor suggests that it may owe something to Ring Lardner's haircut. Of just, I'm going to just say, just like a man making a reference to another man. Mr. Jack, the other male judge, says, found the women, quote, absurd and amusing. And although the story interested him not at all, he was captivated by the, quote, cheap and common causerie of the beauty parlor women, which became alive and interesting in, quote, an exasperating sort of way. So, Harriet, there's more fuel for your arguments.
I don't want to let us forget, too, that when they find out that Mr. Petrie is a rapist, Leota, in a very sensitive fashion, says, 4 women. He's raped 4 women. I guess those women didn't have the faintest notion at the time they'd be worth $125 a piece someday to Mrs. Pike. So we've got the rapist being rivaled by Leota for awfulness. Yeah, Jo Ellen.
I'd just like to comment that the story asks questions. There's kind of a circularity to it. What culture has created the petrified man who's a rapist? And Pearl mentioned Medusas. The story ends with women like Furies or a group of wild-haired ladies like Medusas beating on a little boy and starting a kind of cycle there. In any case, the petrified man has been dehumanized himself, maybe turned into stone. But what culture, this larger culture, which Suzanne's really commented on, has shaped and distorted these women? And it's really surprised me that no one, to my knowledge, has ever talked about Mr. Petrie or Mr. Petrie in terms of Petri dishes, which are meant as cultures for growing life, as growth cultures. And it seems to me there really is a kind of comment that she's using that way. In the US, apparently, I was taught to say Petri dish. Apparently it's more Americanized as Petri, but in the UK it's Petri. But anyway, that's where my mind went the first time I ever read this story.
All right, Harriet.
So two thoughts. I mean, I've talked about the gang spank at the end of the story as the women's response, but for having one male figure in their female bastion. But I was also thinking about Jo Ellen's raising what I think is the question of sympathy for women in the story. I mean, I think that this is a story that is full of a kind of harshness and hardness about these women, but it's also I think sympathetic. I think it's also looking at women who are caught in a culture that defines sexuality as in this way, and if they don't dominate men, they will be dominated by them. So I think that the story, in spite of its satire of women and their behaviors, is full of sympathy.
I agree 100%. I think these women are trying desperately to find some source of power because of the position that they're in. Yeah, Beverly and then Jacob. And then we'll move on to the key, I think.
I think it's also a story about class, because Miss Fletcher is obviously a higher class than Leota, but when Miss Fletcher's sitting in Leota's chair, they are much more equal. You know, you don't want to piss off your hairdresser who's giving you a permanent or whatever else when that person has power over you for that period of time that you're sitting in the chair. So they are much more equal, and there's a whole lot of one-upmanship. You know, when Miss Fletcher says how tall her husband is, Leota's husband's a little bit taller. And, you know, so what we see in this beauty shop is a place where they are equal, where you've got the lower class Leota, the working woman, and then you've got Miss Fletcher, who's Mrs., you know, Mrs. Fletcher, and then Leota by her first name. And it's a place where they are equal, and their opinions mean pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, great point, Beverly. Jacob?
Good to see everybody again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Quick comment regarding what Harriet said. I definitely agree with what she's saying, that it is a sympathetic story. I also think it's a cruel story. I'm interested in two things. One, that the story is not called, say, I don't know, Open House Women, that it's called Petrified Man, that the man in a way gets the first word. And also, I think importantly, that Billy Boy, the child, the boy, gets the last word. That in a way, it's a story about how patriarchy is paused but not ended. These women have an opportunity to speak. It's a space for them, but it's disturbing and upsetting and funny in a cruel way that the boy gets the last word, and it's a cruel joke undercutting whatever space those women say. The boy is seen as a nuisance, not as a really a threat, but then he kind of stabs them all with that last great line. It says, "If you're so funny, why aren't you rich?" That we do realize that patriarchy is perhaps paused, that the violent world of men is outside, but it is encroaching, and they will return to that world, I think, at the end of the story.
I think it's also that line always right. If you're so smart, why ain't you rich? And they've just been saying, you know, Canfield, we're rich. That's what Mrs. Piker said. Canfield, we're rich. We've gotten $125 a piece off those 4 women. And so that kind of materialism that permeates the childhood, the women's culture, the male culture, the American culture. Yeah. Jessica and then Harriet.
Well, before we move on from Petrified Man, I wanted to draw our attention to a really interesting question in the chat that maybe someone here can answer. There is a moment in the Petrified Man where someone says, oh, well, one of them in New Orleans, and I think they're talking about the fortune teller, one of them in New Orleans before it was raided, blah, blah. And so someone was saying, what is Welty referring to with one of them in New Orleans before it was raided? I read that as a Prohibition era raid, which would have been typical in that era. And then someone else wondered if perhaps palm readers or fortune tellers could have been raided, or perhaps they were a front for prostitution or other businesses that could have been raided. If anyone knows that historical fact.
Where is what page is that on, Jessica?
Well, I don't have the edition that I'm supposed to be referencing in front of me. I have another edition that just happened to be sitting on my desk.
Is it about Lady Evangeline? Is that what?
Yes.
Charlotte put in the chat that it's page 22.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Page 22 is the first page of the story in. Let me see if it's.
Well, anyway, if
anyone, yeah, Harriet, go ahead and I'll look here.
I'm just thinking about, well, a couple of responses. One was to Joellen, and my sense that this is a story um, about working women, and that's in itself a kind of remarkable choice for the time. And I'm thinking about how the discussion of abortion, well, while there's a Hemingway story and a few others that are in the era that is about abortion and the difficulty of unwed mothers, this is a story about married women considering abortion. And I was also thinking about the title, which is and Jacob's sense of the patriarchy in Petrified Man, but also the fact that there's no article. It's not the Petrified Man bringing us just to the case of our one petrified man, but rather petrified man is a sense that this whole culture has got something going on which is leading to a kind of hardness or petrification of feelings that should be that shouldn't be petrified in the way that they are.
Okay. Well, I think I found the passage. It's where they're talking about drinking. Is that it? That's the beer Mrs. Pike says is made right in NO. No.
This, no, it's not the beer that's made in NO, but it says, did Mrs. Pike believe in what the fortune teller said? Asked Miss Fletcher in a superior tone of voice. Lord, yes, she's from New Orleans. Everybody in New Orleans believes everything spooky. One of them in New Orleans, before it was raided, says to Mrs. Pike one summer she was going to go from state to state and meet some gray-headed men. So one of them is referring to one of those fortune tellers.
Yeah. Well, I have no idea. If anyone knows, let us know. We'll see. We'll check on it. Okay. All right, let's talk about the key. Following hard on Petrified Man, we have the key. Anyone want to start us off here? There is a film version of this, by the way, which director and producer Francis James made, a short film. And I believe, I couldn't find it. I was trying to check on that the National Theater for the Deaf provided the actors for the film, but it's a good film. Yeah, Joubert.
Well, my first impression was it was an Edward Hopper painting. And I just felt like I was in that, hearing all the voices of all those people, silent, separated, alienated, but still having deep internal ideas. But it was quite a different picture than the last story.
Yeah, so the last story is almost entirely dialogue. Here, the dialogue is by sign language, and we're getting an interpretation of it. Yeah, Cheryl, and then Harriet.
I just am fascinated by the opening. We don't know until later that the couple, that they're deaf, but
right.
That we start with, it was quiet. That's what we start with. It was quiet. And then for me, of what I've read of Welty so far, one of the most brilliant passages in her oeuvre is the from the story with the deaf boy, watching the words, in the wintertime, watching the words.
First love, yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, the words taking shape in the frost as he speaks, yeah. So deafness again, and in Lily Dawn, the 3 ladies, the xylophone player is partially deaf, and we have Joel Mays in First Love. Yeah, Harriet.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the way in which this story is one of the sort that Catherine and Porter was describing as the things that happen inside. And I look back at, a couple of years ago, I stumbled on this novel, that The Night of the Little House in New York, finding something that I didn't expect to find. And it's stayed with me as a kind of moment when there's that the text, this novel attempt is an effort to create a form that Welty's going to recognize is not hers. that she whittles down, which is like 30 pages of this 117-page novel, to the 9 pages of the key. But I was thinking about how complicated the story is at the level of what we know and how we know it. Of whose point of view do we have? I was thinking about the fact that in the novel we have Martha Galen, who is a painter, it's her point of view, but she's also working at an institute for the deaf, and she's in this railroad room looking for the sheriff who is following up on the story of the abuse of Ruby Fisher's daughter by Clyde. And she's observing the red-haired stranger who's going to become her love interest in the novel, and the Morgans. And she, because she's a teacher of the deaf, can read their conversation. But she also watches the red-haired stranger having this full response to them, which it's not fleshed out in the same way that it is in the story as his thoughts, his play with the key. It's not quite so complicated, but he does drop the key, and Albert Morgan picks it up. What there isn't in the story is they're heading to Niagara Falls, but not to this later edition in order to hear the vibration of the falls. But I just think that the story is so interesting from the point of view of deciphering from the way you strangers do in a public setting, a private story, and the complications of this tension between a couple that is together perhaps because they are both deaf rather than because of love, and Albert is excited by the key, and Ellie is too, but Ellie has this history of speaking in a way that is, sour milk dripping from her fingers. That amazing description that suggests to me the trouble in their relationship.
I think it's really interesting that the character in the novel is missing here, but not missing. So that when you start reading the story, it was quiet in the waiting room of the remote little station, except for the night sounds of insects. You could hear their embroidering movements in the weeds, or you could listen to the fat thudding of light bulbs. So here is an observer. You could do this. The narrator calling attention to herself, and she's watching both the redheaded stranger and Albert and Ellie. And in
the story, we don't know that that anybody actually knows what they're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's not explained. But in a way, I think it works very powerfully because it sort of puts us in the position of the narrator, so that we're watching this and we're wondering, how are we going to bridge this gap of empathy that we see that Albert and Ellie encounter, where people say, the deaf and dumb, they're dismissed because of their lack of ability to hear. Yeah, Jo Ellen.
I was going to point that out precisely. In fact, we have an example here of Welty playing with the second person narrative, the you addresses all the way through. And if in the first half of the story, we are pulled in, it can be used as to sucker readers in sometimes, but normally I think it's a sincere gesture on the narrator's part. But so we're pulled into the story. We see what this narrator is seeing, first about Albert and Ellie, and then as importantly about the stranger. I think he's key to the whole thing. And in fact, his perspective, what he is seeing in Albert and Ellie, I think merges. What the narrator would have us see and Albert's, or the stranger's point of view by the end. And where there's one passage where he is brought up for our concern, that we're supposed to see that he also,
Well, you're fading out on us, Joella.
oh, sorry, I'm sorry. That anyway, where he's worried about being too deeply aware. The narrator says this, and in fact, not accomplishing, not acting on what he learns. And I really think that this is about reading, about teaching people to read, and that by the end of this, I just, for the first time, I thought this is just an amazing story. And it really is about the function of reading. The reader being put through an exercise through this story and going back out into our own lives. And I think is a key to the collection to some extent. Anyway, that might not make sense to you.
And it is true that Eudora and her agent, Dermot Russell, wanted to call this book The Key and Other Stories. And when a little publicity story was sent out with a picture of Eudora on the cover in a camellia house, as Pearl has talked about this, it was The Key. That was the story that was used to publicize the book. But powers that be changed their minds on the title. Yeah, Pearl.
I'll just follow up with what Joellen was saying, what you were reading. And I do love how she starts out addressing the reader. I think that's very key, and withholds that they are deaf. But it's not just what you see, it's all the sounds that you hear. And so it's forcing the reader to become more and more alert to the sense of hearing, when that is what's seemingly missing from Albert and Ellie. And in fact, the last line of the first paragraph, some bugs were clinging heavily to the yellow globe. We see that, yes, that's visual. But then she adds in her revisions, like idiot bees to a senseless smell. A senseless smell is sort of oxymoronic or paradoxical, but then you have to hear the bees that are at the globe. So I love how she's playing with our senses as the readers or the observers, making us much more alert to that. And if there's time later, I'll also read what was in Harper's Bazaar. This is the first story that was published in Harper's Bazaar. And that's probably why it was chosen for that little promotional pamphlet, because that was the national magazine, but it was in the college issue. And the description tells where she went to college and so on and so forth. And the Columbia School of Business, from which I came forth into New York side by side with the Depression and edged on back home. So we got her wit, even, in the author's notes kind of thing. So that's, I could say more, but other people have ideas too.
And I wanted to add, emphasize something that Joellen was saying, which I think is really important, is that the stranger, the redhead, is almost incapacitated by the deepness of his empathy, by the depth of his empathy. And then I think the next question is, are we, as we identify with the narrator, are we also going to be, is there a way to bridge the gap for us, as he can't move himself into action, incapacitated by the depth of his feeling for the situation? Yeah, Harriet.
Yeah, I wanted to put too on our list of topics to be surprised that she's treating disability and where she came to her interest in deafness has made me wonder if there's a biographical background that we don't have that would explain this. But then, of course, in Keela too, we're looking at affliction, and I'm just pointing that out as another thread that's running through these stories.
I don't know how much Eudora knew about the deaf school, which was here in Jackson, but there was a deaf school here. And so that might be part of that.
Yeah.
Awareness, yeah.
She might have seen students from the school.
I might have known someone who worked there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Anything else about the key before we talk about Keela, the outcast Indian maiden? Yes, we got Charlotte and Pearl.
I just wanted to say that I know Eudora Welty and Carson McCullers did not get along, but I was wondering if anyone knows anything about either one of them's reaction to the Key or the Heart's Lonely Hunter, because I can just see Carson McCullers being like, she copied me, this is terrible, I hate this, and I can see Eudora Welty being mad about the Heart's Lonely Hunter maybe. So I was just wondering if anybody knew anything about that.
I think Pearl has written about this. Have you not, Pearl?
Well, it's much more about Delta Wedding coming out and being reviewed at the same time as McCullers' wedding story. I think that's much more the piece. I don't know of any specific connection regarding this story. But I wanted to answer something in the chat, which is like, what is the key to it? And to me, when I have studied this story, I come back to Porter's comment in her introduction when she's talking about actually her personal favorites, but I'll quote it here. She likes stories, quote, where external act and internal voiceless life of the human imagination almost meet and mingle on the mysterious threshold of dreaming and the symbol in one. The only kind of symbol that for me as a writer has any weight testifies to the chief pattern of human experience. And to me, that helps me to understand this story. And to me, it is the key to the story, to the relationship.
Jacob.
I feel like my reading for today is a pretty old school, perhaps maybe not in a good way, but this story really strikes me how so much of it matches with the kind of classical symbolism of modernism. If the key text of modernism, as I understand it, is a poem by T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland. And so much of the imagery from that is about characters who are caught in loveless relationships, are deaf, dumb, paralyzed. Those opening images of the Key strike of that world. All of the characters are almost lifeless in this way station going nowhere. A really ominous place. Now that's where the story starts. What's remarkable about it, how it both matches the symbolism of the wasteland, which is a poem that is in pursuit of life and water, becoming fecund again. But what's striking is that we see that at the end of the Key, where they want to go to Niagara Falls. They seek renewal in that kind of Eliot way. But I do think Welty is interested in breaking away from the wasteland imagery too. So much of the story at the beginning sounds like something bad is about to happen. The stranger with the red hair is an imp. He almost seems like he has mischief on the mind, but at the end of the story, all of it gets significantly transformed, not only by this revelation of renewal, going to Niagara Falls, but also that all the characters seem transformed. Like that wasteland feeling seems to go entirely. So I really feel her both playing with that, but wanting to transform it entirely. Most
Boy,
of that.
I have a totally different reaction to the ending of the story. It's not a happy one.
Okay.
They are not going to Niagara Falls.
Mhm.
They have missed their train. They
Missed
won't
it, yeah.
go here in Union. Albert is cherishing the Key, not as a way of uniting the couple, but as his private self. Their chance for communication, that moment of hope where maybe and when the stranger gives her a separate key, he knows he despised and saw the uselessness of the thing he had done. I don't know, Jacob, but I don't read it as renewal. Cheryl.
So I just wanted to say that he takes a second key from his pocket and that it's for a hotel, Star Hotel, room 2, like stars in the sky, and then room 2, like an alternate option. And that's all.
Yeah, so here's another key, but it's I'll balance the keys, but maybe I'll even give him a place to stay tonight. But he saw the uselessness of what he had done. Pearl, and then we'll go on to Keela. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that there are 17 keys in Welty's stories. And this idea of the symbol, she doesn't say very much, very often about the symbol, but in fiction, she says, Welty says, man is intelligible only when he begins to communicate within the strict terms of poetry and reason. Symbols, in the end, both are permanent forms of the act of focusing. And so this helps me to understand the story, thinking about Ellie and Albert speaking, or what they're thinking that we hear, let's say, is like poetry, and they try to reason out the meaning of the key, and the key brings all of this into focus. So I've tried
and they call it a symbol. They think of it as a symbol.
right, exactly. So they're focusing on that as we do.
I want to go back. I know I have read something about the heart is a lonely hunter and the key, comparing them. So I will find out where that reference is and bring it to our next session, because I think that was a good question, but I cannot remember where I read it. I thought it was you, Pearl, but I'm got it wrong. So there you are. Okay, let's talk about Keela, the outcast Indian maiden. What do you make of this story? Anyone want to start us off? Keela, Cheryl.
Hi, I would like to start because so like Beverly and Harriet and Mary Jo know that so Eudora Welty has one of the interviews on YouTube talks about accent in her literature, like using the details of the type of flower or where the sun is at in the sky. And probably with, well, a little bit in when we read The Wide Net, but especially when we did The Optimist's Daughter, I noticed that she uses birds as accents in her writing. And I have got to say that in this story, when Keela or little Leroy is sitting at the steps, like I'm hoping Evelyn Mayton, who does illustrations, can draw this image when she has time. So little Leroy is finally back at his home that he had been taken from. So symbolic of like white supremacy. He was a man with children, and these people just took him to a circus. But he's back at his home, and he's sitting at the top of the steps, and the chickens are like, it's like a pyramid, right? He's at the top of the pyramid, and then the chickens that he had been grotesquely like forced to behead are on the steps, and then the two white men are at the bottom. All right, so that's the pyramid. And then at the particular point in the story, a sparrow lights on his foot, and that's all.
All right, so birds. I think it's also very ironic that here he is surrounded by chickens when he's been forced to play the role of the carnival geek. That is, he snaps the heads off the chickens, he eats them, live chickens, and what a horrible torture he's been forced to endure. He's kidnapped, made to be this sideshow geek, and now we see him having been rescued at home. And I think what Cheryl's pointing to with the pyramid is very important. That's the way we see the characters displayed. Little Leroy at the top, Steve and Max below, and a pyramid. Harriet.
Yeah, I have to say I'm really interested in Cheryl's bird readings. She's been consistently following these birds, and I think there's a rich discussion that's going to come out of it. But I'm focusing on the way in which this story is about the response of her white characters, Steve and Max, to Leroy's exploitation. That there is this kind of, and there's this trio in the story of the Black character, the idea of the Indian, the idea of the woman. We're piling up topics, but I'm thinking about Welty's showing us in Steve and Max's speech, obsessively repeating phrases and gestures. Steve is a portrait of white guilt that he's just discovered his complicity with racial brutality, but his suffering as witness is more important to him than the actual Black man he's been brought to meet. So Steve repeatedly asserts through the text, I was the one. That's what I'm telling you. It's all me. I was the one who was the cause for going on and on. And Max, on the other hand, believes in his certain knowledge of the boy who lives 50 yards down the highway from his place. He's highly invested in proving false Steve's claim to a lot of information. His view of himself is dependent on being the kind of man that could tell a woman from an Indian and a man from a woman and an Indian from a Black boy. His view is dependent on being the kind of man who is understands Leroy is okay. Look, you got him right here. See him, use your eyes. He's okay. And he looks okay to me. It's just you. You're nuts is all. So this looks to me like a portrait of white responses to racial guilt before most people knew there was such a thing. And I think it's a remarkable story on the topic of race in the time period.
The other thing about Max is Max doesn't want to face it. He has totally accepted the system as it is. I know what's going on. I got a jukebox. I'm not listening to this guilt.
Right.
I've got a jukebox. So that he is trying to avoid, as people did, any knowledge of the guilt. Steve is so obsessed by his guilt, he can't do anything to think about atoning for it. Max is the one who has to provide money.
He's got knowledge of the boy who lives 50 yards down the highway. And that's it. Yeah.
And Leroy is at the top of this pyramid, but he has to say, sir. He's very deferential to Max. He knows what he can say and what he can't say in this situation. So it's always sir to Max. Yeah, Cheryl, then I want one other thing here.
Yeah. So Leroy, he knows how to perform in the community that he has been born into. The reactions, the he, the laughter. I put in a quote where he's looking from one white man to the other, excited almost beyond respectful silence. What is respectful silence? That's part of the performance that he has grown, that he has learned. Okay, he had to perform as a alternate gender, an alternate race, but before that he was still a Black man in a Southern community having to conform to societal norms around him. And then I do just want to say, like, with white guilt, but also it was another white man. So Max, or the young guy, he couldn't see, right? He was blind, but the older white man did see, right, and reached out to little Leroy in the cage and eventually worked to set him free. So it's like, white people aren't all bad in the South, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and Steve recognizes that, and he sees the man as a hero, but he cannot get beyond his guilt, I think. The other thing I want to say is that Leroy is also a victim of his own family. So that in a sense, this encounter does put him at the apex of the pyramid. There's somebody who's paying attention to him. When his family, when he says, look what happened today, they say, hush up, Pappy. So that in his own family, his age and his size and his inability to walk without crutches, all of those things have marginalized him, even in his own family, I think. Yeah. Harriet.
Yeah. In the family too, he's saying, he's aggrandizing this past, which is troubling, to say the least. And so the distance between children and parent is complicated. But I was just going to point back to Cheryl's comment on that the laughter that Leroy offers is in the form of saying he these two guys who are endlessly talking about me.
Yeah. And I love what Cheryl said also about the performance.
Yeah.
Everywhere he is, it's a performance. He has to perform in the circus, but he's also having to perform at home. And he's also being with the white culture living around him at home, and in his own family, he's also being silenced. He was silenced in the circus. He's silenced at home. So,
Yeah. And the performance of race in Welty's work is just, it's always attentive to the ways in which race is performed, and has a mandatory script.
Yeah. All right. Anything else about Keela, the outcast Indian maiden? Do you see any similarity between Steve in Keela and the redheaded stranger in the Key? Are these similar? Is this similar situation, similar character types? I think Steve is far more self-aware. Yeah. Cheryl, Joe Ellen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They're two young men struggling to deal with what's around them. In fact, they're petrified in their own ways. But in the key, what's happened to this young man? See, I don't. Anyway, Steve can't get as far as the stranger in the key, but they're suffering in similar ways. I think no action. They're kind of paralyzed.
Jessica, I know we're out of time, so I'll just comment on the Facebook page.
Oh, go ahead, Cheryl. We've got Jessica will let us have one more minute.
I'll let us go a little longer since it's so robust.
Well, I was just going to add, because Suzanne was asking about similarities, but the one of the similarities I have is the traveler, and being alone and searching for something. But that's going to come up more in later stories. But the search or the quest that Joellen was mentioning, I because of her comment and Dr. Mars, now I see that that search for self, I guess it's called, in those two young men. But it'll come up more in the stories with the travelers, the traveling salesman and the other one.
I also think, Cheryl, their eyes were on the sparrow, as might be something to think about there with your sparrow. So,
exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Jessica.
Well, this is just kind of our last call. We're coming up on time. And unless there's anything else, I will just say thanks for being with us. And next week, we're going to talk about the Why I Live at the PO, the Hitchhikers. I've lost my notes. What's the third one?
Memory.
And the Whistle and the Hitchhikers. So
Okay.
that'll be a really good discussion.
That's right.
Next
Why I
week.
Live at the PO, the Whistle, and the Hitchhikers.
Yes.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.